The monthly Vossridge dinners were less about family and more about flaunting. That evening, the air inside the estate's glass atrium clung thick with candle wax, truffle oil, and entitlement. I took my usual seat near the fireplace, away from the chandelier-lit table, where my cousins held court and waited for the ritual to begin. My latest land acquisition in Jackson Hole borders a compound owned by a space tech billionaire. Griffin Voss announced, swirling his Bordeaux like it had just told him a secret. Sloane gave a breathy laugh and lifted her rose-gold clutch onto the table. We just signed on a vineyard in Saint-Emilion. Private helipad. Not that we use it. Much. I sipped my iced tea slowly, letting the chill of the glass cut through the warmth of my palm. The clink of cutlery echoed through the atrium as someone somewhere dissected a steak that cost more than the monthly rent of one of my tenants. If only they knew. Cambria Voss, my father's sister and the reigning matriarch of spectacle, turned her sharp eyes toward me. "You've been quiet, Riley," she said, her voice slicing the air. Still in that little apartment downtown, the moment landed like a dropped fork. All conversation paused, an unspoken cue for the performance to begin. Griffin leaned across the table, his mock sympathy dripping. "That place on Juniper Lane, right, still renting, didn't know people our age still did that. I like the space," I replied evenly, placing my glass back down. The truth hovered in the air like smoke. That building was my company's first asset. They thought I was a tenant. I was actually the owner. "You're 35, sweetheart," Cambria chimed in, her smile both pitiful and scolding. "It's time you grew up and bought something real. Something real. Like a $2.1 billion portfolio of multifamily dwellings, commercial towers, and historic redevelopments, all under the quiet arm of Juniper North Ventures. Including the Courtyard on Marion, where they gathered monthly and paraded their curated lives." "I've managed just fine," I said, keeping my tone neutral. Griffin smirked. "Please. You can't even get a mortgage approved." I let it hang there. Let them believe I was struggling. Let them forget that the lease renewal for this very estate would land on their desks next week bearing my signature. "Marshall Voss." My father gave a half-hearted chuckle and finally glanced up from his wine. Now, Griffin. Not everyone's path is the same, but some paths," Cambria sighed, "lead to dead ends. Especially without a hedge fund husband or at least a respectable business blog. They thought I was a real estate assistant scraping commission from showing low-rent walk-ups to broke grad students. They had no clue that Riley Voss, the family misfit, was also the founder of Juniper North, an entity they couldn't trace, because I built it not to be seen, only felt." Sloane picked at her beet salad and added with a coy smile, "Have you heard about what's happening on Juniper Lane? Some firm bought the whole block. Word is it's all getting razed." My thumb traced the curve of my glass. I was the buyer, and no, it wasn't being torn down. The building was undergoing historic renovation, brick facades, preserved tenant protections, locked-in rent ceilings, respected. It was my first love, my proof that success didn't have to bulldoze people to matter. "Really," I said. "Hadn't heard. Of course not." Griffin said, smug, "Deals that size are way out of your league. If you get evicted," Cambria offered sweetly, "you can always move into the guest house again. We'll help you find something more presentable, maybe even someone." "I'm happy," I said quietly. "So is my landlord," Sloane giggled. "You can't live small forever, Riley. The Voss name used to mean something. It still did, just not how they thought. Out there in boardrooms and investment panels, Juniper North stood for ethical acquisition, community-first design, and legacy preservation. We didn't just build, we honored. We didn't chase clout, we created shelter." Actually, my father added, adjusting his tie, "This dinner's partly business. The board's concerned about a new stakeholder in the Courtyard on Marion." I tilted my head. This was new. "Juniper North Ventures," he continued. "Acquired a majority stake 6 months ago. No one knows who they are. Possibly offshore money. Definitely legacy hunting." Griffin nodded. "These private funds love historic assets. If only they knew the founder of Juniper North was sitting 3 feet away in a thrifted cardigan, vintage boots, and a silent resolve that had taken 10 years to perfect. And they've requested a full audit," Marshall added, his voice tightening, "especially around building fund allocations." I caught the flicker across Sloane's face. Griffin blinked. Of course they were nervous. The audit would uncover Preston's unauthorized loan for his Jackson Hole retreat. and Sloane's handbag expense reports labeled client development. It would tear open the shell game they'd perfected. Maybe Riley could help Sloane, said suddenly Sugary. She's in real estate, right? Maybe she knows someone at the firm. They all turned to me like pigeons spotting a breadcrumb. Mostly smaller residential clients, I said with a smile. Nothing on the scale of Marion. You can't even help your own family, Griffin snapped. Mom looked away. Cambria clicked her pearls. Dad was back to scrolling. My usefulness had expired. But they had no idea how helpful I was about to be. Just not in the way they hoped. That night, I returned home to my office, an entire penthouse floor overlooking downtown Eugene, and prepared for the moment I had been building toward for years. The documents were ready. The ownership statement was queued. If you've ever been mocked by people who measure worth by appearances, ask yourself this: what are you building in silence while they laugh? What would you have done if you were me? And if you want to see what happens when truth walks into the boardroom in heels and says, "Good morning, don't miss what comes next," subscribe. Because this is the part where the game changes. The next morning, light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office like a quiet affirmation. From up here downtown, Eugene looked peaceful, almost unaware of what was about to unfold. I sipped my cappuccino slowly, standing by the polished concrete floor that reflected everything I'd built. Kendra entered without knocking. She never needed to. We'd worked together for nearly a decade through every acquisition legal maneuver and disguised LLC. She handed me the audit summary bound in charcoal gray leather. "Final confirmations are in," she said. "Board's meeting at the Courtyard in 4 hours. Everyone's already circling, trying to guess who Juniper North is." "Let them circle," I replied. "They won't land until I say so." She paused, then added forensic team uncovered even more than expected. Double billing, private travel under building maintenance. Even Cambria's garden statues were charged to tenant morale beautification. I didn't laugh. I didn't need to. Instead, I walked to the far wall where I'd framed a simple black and white photo me, at 23, holding my real estate license outside a beat-up office on 4th Street. My hair was too short, my smile too wide. No one had believed in me back then, not even my mother. "You're wasting your time," she'd said once. "You don't have the pedigree or the patience." But what I lacked in pedigree, I made up for in pattern recognition and patience, that I'd weaponized into an art. My first commission check had gone straight into a rundown fourplex near a community college. I renovated it with my own hands. I lived in the smallest unit. I ate pasta 5 nights a week. I learned leases like language zoning laws like scripture. I said little. I watched everything. Back then at Vossridge dinners, they still invited me to sit at the table. Until one year I brought a contractor as my date. After that, they called me unpredictable, unrefined. It was fine. Better even. Because the further they pushed me out, the clearer I could see. I returned to my desk, where the public statement draft waited on my screen. The title was simple: Juniper North Ventures confirms full ownership of the Courtyard on Marion. Below that, a subtitle, Founder Riley Voss, outlines new era of ethical development and operational transparency. Kendra watched me scroll through the bullet points. Full operational audit underway. Suspension of all nepotistic contracts. Revised lease terms to benefit long-term tenants. No further asset stripping under the guise of renovations. She spoke softly. "Once this goes live, Riley, there's no going back." "I know," I said. "It's the point." I ran a fingertip along the edge of the keyboard. The same hands that once scrubbed tile grout now hovered over policy declarations that would change the trajectory of every name at that dinner table. I still remembered the sting from Cambria's voice at my high school graduation. "She's not Voss material. She's practical." That word had hung like a slur for years. Practical, modest, boring. And yet here I was holding the deeds to everything they thought belonged to them. I opened the drawer beneath my desk and retrieved the embossed letterhead of Juniper North. Clean serif font, no flourish, just clarity. I signed the final board notice and sealed it. Downstairs, my driver waited to take me to the boardroom at the Courtyard. It wouldn't be my first time there, but it would be the first time walking in under my own name. Kendra lingered in the doorway. "You never told me why you kept living at Juniper Lane." I looked at her surprised. She clarified. "You could have moved out years ago, bought something flashier, built a glass tower with your name on it." I shrugged. "Because I wanted to stay grounded." And I meant that, literally. My neighbors on Juniper Lane weren't investors or influencers. They were nurses, veterans, teachers, single parents. When their water heaters broke, I didn't send a crew, I went myself. Sometimes I still did. The day I decided to buy the whole block, it wasn't because I saw profit. It was because I saw people who deserved to stay. Not be priced out by cousins playing developer on trust funds they didn't earn. At exactly 10:58 a.m., I pressed send on the announcement email. One copy to the media, one to the board, one to the Voss family group thread, which I hadn't messaged in 5 years. Kendra watched the status bar flash. "That's it," she said. "It's public now." I adjusted the navy Altuzara suit I'd chosen deliberately, and picked up the briefcase filled with reports, receipts, and resolutions. As we left the office, I passed a small wall plaque, bronze-aged, understated. It read, "Built with intention, not for show." Outside, the city buzzed as usual. No headlines screamed yet, but they would. And when they did, I wouldn't have to say anything. Because for the first time in years, the name Riley Voss was about to mean something. Not to them, to me. And if you've ever felt small in a room full of loud voices, if you've ever had to swallow your worth just to keep the peace, know this: you don't have to play their game. You can build your own. I'm not done yet. Next stop, the boardroom. The courtyard on Marion didn't look threatening from the outside. Its sandstone facade and wrought iron balconies gave it the appearance of an old money fortress, charming, elite, untouchable. Inside, the boardroom gleamed with polished wood and velvet chairs. Fresh-cut orchids lined the center of the table. A carafe of mineral water sat untouched beside embossed agendas marked "Confidential." I arrived 5 minutes early. The others were already there. Griffin stood by the window, gesturing dramatically as he recounted some imagined victory to the independent board members. Sloane sipped from a porcelain cup, legs crossed too perfectly, her expression a study in poised confusion. Cambria sat stiffly at the head of the table, a pearl brooch glinting against her blazer. My father, Marshall, hunched slightly, flipping through a thick manila folder he clearly hadn't read. When I entered, the shift in the room was immediate. Griffin turned, his voice caught in mid-sentence. "Who let you in? This is a private session," Sloane added coldly. I set my briefcase on the table and calmly pulled out a chair 1 seat from the head. "I'm Riley Voss," I said, "founder and sole owner of Juniper North Ventures, the firm that owns this building, and several others you've mishandled." Silence dropped like a pane of shattered glass. Cambria's face went paper white. My father stopped flipping pages. Sloane's cup clinked quietly as her fingers faltered. Griffin blinked twice, his mouth trying to form sound. "You're joking," he finally said. I opened the briefcase and began sliding thick tabbed documents across the table. "No, but these are very serious." I handed the audit reports one by one to the board members. My voice was level, unshaken. Each folder contains detailed records of financial inconsistencies, linked to the Courtyard's operating account over the past 4 years. "You have no right," Cambria began. I cut her off gently. "I have every right. As majority owner, I requested the audit." She looked down at the papers, her lips parting slightly as the numbers began to tell the story she thought was buried. My father cleared his throat. "Riley, this is unnecessary. We can resolve any discrepancies." "No," I said, my gaze steady. "Not quietly, not this time." I turned a page. "Griffin, would you like to explain the $2 million allocated for emergency roof repairs, which was rerouted to purchase your Jackson Hole property?" He flushed a deep, furious red. "That's absurd. The forensic trail isn't." I slid another report forward. "Sloane, your husband's plumbing company billed triple market rate for standard installations. Half the invoices are identical, copy-pasted down to the typo in mainline maintenance. Want to explain that?" She didn't speak. Her knuckles went pale. Cambria stood abruptly. "You'd expose your own family like this?" I looked her in the eye. "You exposed yourselves." "I'm just turning on the lights." She sat down slowly, the authority bleeding out of her shoulders. Marshall finally found his voice quiet and almost broken. "You could have come to me. I did. Years ago. You told me I wasn't Voss material. Remember?" He closed his eyes. "I worked," I said softly but firmly. "I saved. I built. While you burned through trust funds and claimed the name Voss meant vision." Griffin shoved his chair back. "What do you want? A medal revenge?" No, I said. I want accountability. And then the moment arrived. Phones buzzed around the table first, one, then three, then all. A board member tapped his screen and read aloud. Juniper North CEO revealed Riley Voss, heiress to the Voss family, owns 2.1B real estate portfolio. He looked up at me slowly, ranked among top ethical developers on the West Coast. The words hit the room like thunder after a slow-building storm. Griffin sat down hard. Sloane dropped her phone. Cambria didn't move, but Marshall stared at me not with anger but awe, like he was finally seeing the daughter he'd ignored not just as competent, but as something else entirely unstoppable. This will ruin us, Sloane whispered. No, I replied. This will save you from yourselves. I turned to the independent board members. As of this morning, a full operational reform is in motion. No more creative accounting. No more sweetheart contracts. No more treating the Courtyard as a personal bank account. Griffin scoffed. And if we don't comply, I smiled faintly. Then these reports go directly to federal authorities. And I'm sure the IRS would love a look. You could feel it then, the moment of full collapse, the ego bleeding out of every suit in the room. For a beat, no one spoke. Finally, Marshall asked quietly, "What do you want from us?" I met his eyes. "I want you to remember what the name Voss used to mean. Not champagne listings and marketing fluff, but community, respect, a legacy built, not bought." Then I stood. "This isn't revenge," I said, gathering my papers. "This is repair." And I left the boardroom as the new Voss. Not the one they expected, but the one they'd never forget. And if you've ever been surrounded by people who only see what they want to see, don't try to change their vision. Change your vantage point. Because from the head of the table, everything looks different. By the time I reached the lobby, my phone was already buzzing nonstop. 16 missed calls, dozens of text messages, mentions on social media climbing by the minute. I didn't open them. Instead, I stepped out into the crisp air of late autumn. The sky hung low over Eugene, heavy with gray cloud. But to me, it felt like the most honest sky I'd seen in years. No glitter, no fog, just truth. Kendra was waiting by the car, expression unreadable. "It's done," she said. "No," I replied, slipping into the back seat. "It's just starting." Inside the vehicle, I watched through tinted glass as reporters began gathering at the Courtyard entrance. Someone must have leaked the confirmation. Probably Sloane, trying to control the narrative. But this time she couldn't. We drove in silence for a while. My mind ran through the layers ahead: contract terminations, audits across sister properties, staff retraining. A legal labyrinth of cleanup. Media's framing it as a scandal, Kendra said. But the public response is shockingly in your favor. "Why shocking?" I asked. She glanced at me. "Because you didn't perform." She was right. I hadn't made a scene. I hadn't raised my voice. No shouting, no revenge monologue. Just paperwork, dates, numbers, facts. And maybe that's what people needed now. Truth that didn't have to scream. We stopped at Juniper Lane. My apartment looked the same from the outside: aged brick, faded shutters, an old red bicycle still chained near the entrance. But inside, it was home. And now, the world knew the woman who lived here owned 10 city blocks. I slipped off the suit jacket, folded it with care, and pulled on a soft cardigan. The press would want an interview. The board would want compromise. My family would want answers. They could all wait. I made tea, loose leaves, chamomile. As the kettle boiled, I turned on the small speaker in my kitchen, letting instrumental piano echo quietly in the space. No headlines, no buzz, just breath and bone and soft light catching on the rim of my mug. A soft knock came at the door. Kendra again, holding a printout. "They've started issuing public statements," she said. "Cambria's stepping down from all 3 civic boards she sits on. Griffin's lawyers are trying to mitigate exposure on the building fund transfer. Sloane hasn't responded yet." I took the pages and scanned them slowly. The statements reeked of damage control. Phrases like administrative oversight and family miscommunication. But the one that made me pause was from Marshall. He'd released a note on company letterhead. I misunderstood what legacy truly meant. My daughter didn't embarrass us. She preserved what we were supposed to protect. It wasn't an apology. Not yet. But it was closer than I ever expected. That evening, as the sun slid behind the hills, a flurry of headlines emerged across every platform. The billionaire renter, Riley Voss. Breaks silence, Juniper North. The ghost company, with a sole ethical empire. How one woman outplayed her own family. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. But beneath that was a strange warmth. Not pride, not relief, something quieter, a knowing. That night I lay in bed listening to the hum of life outside, the clink of a neighbor's dishes, the slow creak of pipes, a baby crying faintly 1 unit over. This was my world, still small, still human, still mine. I wasn't building towers to be seen from the sky. I was building places where people could belong. And tomorrow I'd return to the office not for applause, but for contracts, for construction schedules, for code compliance meetings. I'd meet with the preservation team about the roof line on a building from 1924. Because headlines fade, but good design stays. In the morning, I'd open my inbox. I'd deal with Griffin's threats, Cambria's guilt, Sloane's silence. I'd take calls from journalists and attorneys, from partners and skeptics. And I'd keep walking forward, because now they knew, and they could never unknow it. Not the family, not the board, not the city. They saw who I was, and for the first time, so did I. If you've ever had to live quietly, patiently, even painfully, while others flaunted shortcuts, this is for you. Because sometimes silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. And when the time is right, when the room is ready, truth enters, quietly sets down a folder, and begins to change everything. 3 days after the announcement, the real work began. Not the press interviews or the investor calls, that was noise. What mattered now was the structure, the bones, the slow, intentional recalibration of a broken ecosystem. At 7:45 a.m. sharp, I walked into the main operations office of the Courtyard on Marion this time. Not as a guest, not as a renter in disguise, but as the rightful steward of the building. It felt like stepping into a machine I'd quietly studied for years and was now allowed to touch. "Morning, Ms. Voss," said Gerald, the maintenance lead, standing a little straighter than usual. "Just Riley," I smiled. The building still looked immaculate to an untrained eye, gleaming lobby fresh paint, the usual fragrance of over-scented diffusers. But I knew what lay beneath: delayed plumbing repairs, elevator service billed 3 times the standard rate, a janitorial contract managed by Sloane's old college roommate that charged more for mopping than most firms did for marble polish. That ends today. I met with the full staff in the downstairs conference room. No velvet chairs here, just steel folding ones and a whiteboard with dried ink from 3 fiscal years ago. I didn't speak from behind a podium. I sat on the edge of the table, sleeves rolled. "This building will be run differently now," I said. "You won't need connections to keep your job, just competence." A few exchanged uncertain looks. I continued. "We'll be reviewing all contracts. Some will end. Others will be renegotiated. If you've been underpaid or overlooked, speak now. If you've been overpaid for underwork, consider this notice." Still silence. Then Gerald raised his hand. "What about maintenance backlog? We've had 3 units without proper heat since October. Management kept pushing it off." I nodded. "We'll handle them first. I'll inspect them myself." He blinked. "You..." "Well, I've fixed worse. Give me a wrench and a Saturday." That broke the tension. Later that afternoon, I walked through the back stairwell with one of the tenant association reps, a woman named Elsie, who'd lived on the 2nd floor since 1989. Back in the day, she said, squinting upward at the ceiling vents, they used to fix things fast, before it all turned into some rich kid's vanity project. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. She looked at me hard. "You really own this?" "I do." Her lips pressed together, thoughtful. "And you're not going to sell it to some condo flipper?" "No." "Why not?" I smiled. "Because homes aren't meant to be flipped. They're meant to be lived in." She didn't respond, just gave a firm nod before disappearing into her apartment. Progress wasn't just about paperwork, it was about trust. And trust takes time. The next day, I terminated 7 service contracts, restructured the building budget, and replaced the management firm with one I vetted personally, quiet professionals with track records of tenant-first policies. Word began to spread. Not through headlines this time, through hallway whispers, landlord meetings, union reps, and small business owners who'd once been bullied into overpriced leases. And through the family, Griffin sent a cease and desist letter bluster packaged in legal stationery. I replied with an email. I suggest focusing on amending your tax records. Discovery season is coming. Sloane stayed silent, not a word, not even a masked Instagram story, which for her was its own kind of submission. Cambria attempted damage control. She invited me to a charity gala in Seattle, something about women in leadership. I declined. I'm already leading, I wrote back. I just don't need applause for it. But Marshall surprised me. He called. It wasn't a plea or an apology. It was quiet. I read the press briefing, he said. Didn't know about the Veterans Housing Initiative. There's a lot you didn't know, I replied. He sighed. I was wrong. I didn't say anything. I want to learn, he added. Not interfere, just understand what you've built. That caught me off guard, so I said yes, not out of forgiveness, but because the work matters more than the wound. That weekend I walked him through Juniper Lane. I showed him the original blueprints, the rent rolls, the redesigned proposals I'd written by hand years ago. He asked questions, took notes. He looked at the brickwork like it meant something again. This is more than I thought, he murmured. I know. That night I returned to my apartment. Kendra had left a manila folder on my desk, new investment offers from 3 major cities: Miami, Austin, Vancouver. I read none of them. Instead, I stared out the window at the quiet street. A kid rode a scooter down the sidewalk. Wind tugged at the laundry line across the alley. Someone played jazz piano 2 floors above me. This wasn't the climax. This was the rebuild. Because tearing down the lie was only half the work. Now came the harder part, proving something better could take its place. And I was ready. If you've ever had to fix something you didn't break, if you've ever chosen principles over approval, then maybe you understand this. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't shout louder, it's stay and build quietly, until the whole system starts to sound like you. By the end of the second week, the cracks had become canyons. Cambria Voss resigned from all 3 civic boards she once chaired. Health reasons, her spokesperson claimed. But word on the street said otherwise. Donors had pulled out. Her name no longer opened doors. It closed them. Sloane's husband's contracting firm collapsed under the weight of incoming audits and lawsuits. Apparently billing the city for 10 times the actual labor cost had a paper trail longer than expected. Their home in Millview went on the market within days. Griffin fared no better. His Jackson Hole property was seized under asset forfeiture pending federal investigation. News stations played aerial shots of his luxury chalet, alongside footage of the Courtyard's maintenance reports, the same ones he'd falsified. And Marshall. He showed up at Juniper Lane unannounced, not in a tailored suit, not with an entourage, just a gray wool sweater and worn loafers that looked older than me. I opened the door and gestured silently for him to enter. He stood in the center of my modest living room, eyes scanning the exposed brick, the stacked books, the faded rug. "This is where you live?" he asked. "This is where I lead." He sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees. I didn't know how far gone it all was. "You didn't want to know," I replied. "Because the illusion was profitable." He nodded slowly. "You could have ruined us." I turned to face him fully. That was never the goal. I didn't want to destroy anything. I wanted to reset the compass, to remind this family what it used to stand for. He looked at the photo frame beside my window. It held an old picture of great-grandfather Voss, the original builder, the man who started with 1 duplex and a dream of dignified housing for returning war veterans. "I found his journals," I said. He wrote about tenants by name, remembered their birthdays, spent his own savings to fix leaks when the budget failed. Marshall's voice cracked. "We lost that." "You didn't lose it," I said gently. "You sold it." We sat in silence, the weight of years between us. "I want to start again," he said finally, "not in your spotlight, just somewhere behind you, watching, learning." For the first time in decades, I believed him, but trust would take time. The next morning, I stood at the window of my office on the top floor of Juniper North headquarters. Below, the city moved in its quiet rhythm, dog walkers, buses, a bakery, opening its shutters. My phone pinged. Not a crisis, not a threat, just a photo from Gerald, the maintenance lead. It showed a newly repaired unit on the 4th floor of the Courtyard. Radiators working, fresh paint, a tenant smiling with her 2 kids. Underneath it, backlog cleared, all heat restored. I stared at it for a moment, longer than I expected. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. This is what mattered. Later that day, I hosted a small meeting with tenant reps from multiple properties. We sat on mismatched chairs, ate pastries from the cafe downstairs, and drafted new tenant rights protocols together. No suits, no PR, just people building rules that worked. One woman leaned over at the end and said, "I never thought the landlord would listen, let alone ask us first." I smiled. Maybe it's time to rewrite what a landlord is. That evening, as I left the office, I found something strange taped to the front door of Juniper Lane. A handwritten letter from Cambria. It read, "You win. I won't pretend to understand you. But I know this family wouldn't have survived what's coming if you hadn't stepped in. I still don't agree with how you did it, but I'm beginning to understand why. I hope one day we can talk without boardrooms or signatures between us." Cambria, no apology, but something close. For her, that was monumental. And I wasn't seeking apologies anyway. I was building a new language. One where humility didn't mean weakness. One where quiet didn't mean irrelevant. One where power meant stewardship, not control. By the end of the month, the Courtyard on Marion had completed its first month of transparent operations. Tenant satisfaction was up. Small vendors were back. And we'd closed the books with zero discrepancies. Legacy was no longer a name embroidered on cufflinks. It was a contract written with integrity, signed in good faith, and enforced with resolve. If you've ever been underestimated because you didn't shout, if you've ever been told that you don't belong at the table, build your own, and one day they'll ask to sit with you. But the question won't be whether you say yes. It'll be whether they've learned how to speak your language. 6 months later, everything was quieter, not silent, just steadier, grounded. I was in my apartment on Juniper Lane, sitting cross-legged on the floor with quarterly reports spread around me. The city hummed softly outside, filtered through the open window and the scent of rain on brick. Ashcroft Plaza, now under its real name again, the Courtyard on Marion, was thriving. Leases were stable. Small retailers on the ground floor were turning healthy profits. The garden in the inner courtyard had become a favorite spot for residents again. No more marble statues, just real trees, real benches, real community. I took a deep breath and leaned back against the wall. No headlines this week, no lawsuits, no family chaos, just work and impact. A knock on the door startled me. When I opened it, I found someone I didn't expect. My mother. Isla Voss stood in a gray cardigan and jeans, no makeup, no pearls, no posture. For a moment, I didn't even recognize her. She held a white envelope in one hand. "I got your invitation," she said. I'd mailed it weeks ago, a simple card for the Courtyard holiday gathering. No formal RSVP, no pressure, just an open door. "It's not quite your scene," I said gently. "No," she admitted, glancing past me into the apartment. "But maybe scene isn't everything." She stepped inside. Her gaze landed on the photo near the kitchen, me at 23 beaming beside the sign that said, "Licensed Real Estate Broker, Oregon State." "I never asked," she said. "Why this?" I hesitated, then replied, "Because I wanted to build something real, not just buy it, not just inherit it." She nodded slowly. "And now," she said quietly, "you control more than all of us." "I do," I admitted. She looked me in the eye. "But you don't use it like we did." I smiled faintly. Control was never the goal. Purpose was. We sat at the small kitchen table. She ran her fingers along the worn edge. "Will you teach me?" she asked. That question hit deeper than I expected. "Come tonight," I said. "Meet the families who've lived here for decades. Listen, that's where legacy begins." Later that evening, the Courtyard lights twinkled in soft gold across the red brick walls. Children laughed over sugar cookies. A jazz trio played near the fountain. Residents mingled beside folding tables filled with homemade food. And in the middle of it, all my family. Marshall stood beside Mr. Keller, a WWAT vet, and our longest-term tenant, helping string fairy lights along the fence. Cambria stood quietly in a corner, talking with a woman from the tenants' council. Her posture was looser, less performance, more presence. Sloan hadn't come, not yet. Maybe she never would, but that was her journey. My mother sat beside Mrs. Lopez, who'd lived in the building for 38 years, listening intently as she recounted stories of raising 4 kids in a 2-bedroom unit. There was something raw in my mother's eyes, like she was seeing a version of success she'd never been taught to value. I leaned against the brick wall, sipping cider, watching it all unfold. And then Griffin appeared. He wasn't dressed like himself, no velvet blazer, no watch. Just a windbreaker and sneakers. He stayed on the edge of the gathering, unsure if he should approach. Eventually, he did. "You win," he muttered. "This wasn't a contest," I said. He looked around. "It was. We just didn't know what game you were playing." I didn't reply. There was nothing left to prove. He cleared his throat. "I saw the renovations. They're different." "Respectful," I corrected. He nodded. "Yeah, that." And then almost inaudibly, "I get it now. Not all the way, but more than before. Progress didn't always wear a medal. Sometimes it just wore humility." Before he left, he handed me a small card, a simple message. "If you ever need someone to paint baseboards, I owe you." And I still remember how. That made me laugh. A real one. As the evening wound down, I found myself near the fountain alone for a moment. Kendra appeared beside me holding 2 cups of hot cocoa. She handed me one. "You did it," she said. I shook my head. "We did it, and we're still doing it." She looked around the courtyard. "This is what legacy feels like, isn't it?" "No," I said softly. "This is what healing feels like. Legacy comes later. If we do this right, it won't even have my name on it. Just good walls, clean water, fair leases, safe homes. Because that's what lasts. Not newspaper features, not fundraisers, not surnames carved in stone, but the quiet things. The roofs that don't leak, the heat that works in winter, the walls that hold stories without judgment. If you've ever been pushed aside because your dream didn't sparkle loud enough, if you've ever been laughed at for starting small, if you've ever been called not enough, you're not alone. I see you, and I hope you build something real, not to prove them wrong, but to offer the world a better version of right." The courtyard was nearly empty now. Paper lanterns swayed gently in the night breeze. Folding chairs had been stacked. The last batch of sugar cookies had disappeared into paper napkins. Even the jazz trio had packed up their soft farewell melody, still hanging in the cool air like a final exhale. I stood alone beside the garden fountain, hands in my coat pockets, breath visible in the cold, watching the ripples in the water dance beneath the reflection of string lights overhead. It was quiet. Not the hollow kind, the full kind, the kind that follows something hard-earned. Behind me, laughter drifted faintly from one of the apartment windows. Children, maybe Mrs. Lopez's grandkids, maybe someone new. It didn't matter. The building was alive. That was enough. I took a slow breath and looked up at the windows glowing above me, little square stories I'd helped protect. Not through headlines, not through vengeance, just through choices, brick by brick, lease by lease, person by person. Footsteps crunched behind me. It was my father. Marshall Voss joined me silently, carrying 2 cups of cider. He handed me one without a word, then leaned beside me on the fountain's edge like he had done when I was 10 and terrified of math homework. We didn't speak for a long while. Then he said quietly, "You could have walked away, years ago, left us to rot in our illusion." I almost did, I admitted. But I didn't build Juniper North just to prove something. I built it because I believe people deserve better, even if they don't realize it yet. He nodded slowly. "Your great-grandfather would have been proud." I gave a faint smile. "He's the reason I stayed." Marshall looked up at the courtyard walls. "We used to think legacy was about scale, ownership, recognition." I turned toward him. "Legacy is about stewardship, about what happens when no one's watching, about what still stands when your name has faded off the plaque." He didn't argue. Instead, he sipped quietly, then said, "Cambria asked me today if she should move out of the family estate. Said she doesn't feel entitled to it anymore." I raised an eyebrow. "What did you say?" I said. "That's between her and her conscience." I laughed softly. He looked at me, more serious now. "And what about you, Riley? What do you want now?" I thought about it. Not the power, I already had it. Not the validation, I'd outgrown it. Not the money, I'd used it to restore rather than dominate. What I wanted was continuity. "I want to keep building," I said simply. "Keep listening, keep offering something that lasts longer than a name." He nodded. "Then maybe this family's not done yet." And maybe we weren't. Not the way we had been, but maybe something better. Eventually, he left. I stayed. one more lap around the courtyard. One more glance at the bricks, the lights, the old wooden benches someone had finally decided to sand and repaint. Near the back exit, I spotted a note pinned to the bulletin board. It was handwritten, no signature. Thank you for not tearing us down. Thank you for seeing value before anyone else did. We were here before the towers, before the headlines. And now we get to stay. That matters more than you'll ever know. I folded the note gently and tucked it into my coat pocket. No spotlight, no signature, just truth. As I walked back up to my apartment, I passed the mural we'd commissioned for the back hallway. Bright colors, handprints of local children, a line at the bottom that read, "Home is not what we own. It's what we preserve." Inside, my desk lamp was still on. Emails blinked on the screen. A meeting invite from a mayor's office in another city. A press request. A policy group asking for consultation. But I didn't open any of them. Not tonight. I made tea, sat by the window, let the hum of the building settle around me, and then I whispered something to the quiet. I'm not here to prove anything anymore. I'm just here to stay and build. And last, if you've ever felt invisible while others stole the spotlight, if you've ever been told you were too quiet, too plain, too late, let this be proof. You don't need applause to do something extraordinary. Sometimes the greatest triumph doesn't roar, it endures. I used to think vindication would feel louder, that when the time came when I stood at the top, when everything they'd ever dismissed me for was reversed, I'd want fireworks, headlines, echoes. But that was never it. Sitting here now wrapped in a knit blanket beside my apartment window, the city soft and blue around me, I finally understand the loudest kind of victory is the one that never needed an audience. Because I didn't build Juniper North for applause. I didn't stay at Juniper Lane to prove a point. I stayed because it was honest. And in a world full of noise, honesty is its own kind of rebellion. The truth is, they called me poor. They laughed about my apartment. They offered charity disguised as kindness, pity disguised as concern. And I let them. Because when you're underestimated, you're free. Free to build in silence. Free to move without scrutiny. Free to outlast them all without ever raising your voice. They wanted to be seen. I wanted to be effective. They chased impressions. I chased impact. And in the end, that difference built everything. The Courtyard on Marion stands not because I outsmarted my family, but because I outlasted the idea that legacy requires permission. I didn't need theirs. And if you're still waiting for someone to give you permission, here it is. You don't have to be loud. You don't have to be born into power. You don't have to wear a title to lead. What you need truly is consistency, clarity, conviction. You build quietly, you rise gradually, and then one day you realize you are the room. Not just someone walking into it, not someone asking for a seat at the table. You're the architect, the one who laid the bricks, who chose where the windows face, who decided the table should exist at all. That's what Juniper North became, a blueprint for a better way. Not cleaner spreadsheets, but cleaner motives, not taller towers, but deeper roots, not louder names, but lives, real ones made better by the spaces they inhabit. This story was never about taking revenge on my family. It was about redefining what family could mean. Because now when Marshall visits, he listens more than he speaks. Cambria writes notes instead of statements. Griffin is volunteering for a community-build hammer and hand sweat on his brow. And my mother, she's learning how to sit with discomfort, how to hold space instead of control it. They're changing, not perfectly, not permanently, but enough. And as for me, I'm still here, at Juniper Lane, with my brick walls, my creaky floors, my hand-picked plants on the windowsill, still reading leases, still fixing radiators, still showing up to board meetings with coffee and blueprints, still building, not because they finally saw me, but because I've always seen what could be. And I hope you do too. Because if there's one thing I've learned from this life, from this slow, quiet, grounded climb, it's this. You don't have to fight to be heard. You have to stay to be felt. So wherever you are, whatever they've called you, whatever they've tried to take from you, don't shout. Build, and let your work speak for itself. Because sometimes the best kind of triumph doesn't end with a round of applause. It ends with legacy, quiet, strong, unshakable, and yours. What did you think of Riley's story? Have you ever been called less than just because you chose a quieter path? Have you ever been underestimated, only to rise on your own terms. Let me know in the comments, what have you built in silence while others doubted you, if you believe that true legacy isn't loud, it's lasting. If you've ever held your ground built with purpose or found power in being overlooked, then this story was for you. Drop your thoughts below. Tell me where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe to EN True Tales, where every story proves sometimes the quietest voice carries the deepest truth.